A commercial fisherman named Marcos Figueiredo had worked the Blackwater channels east of Tefe for 15 years before the wet season of 1947, and when the folklorist from Sao Paulo sat across from him in that small house near the market dock and set the recording machine on the table between them, Marcos spent a long time looking at the machine before he said anything at all. He had sent the man away once already, 2 years before, when a different researcher had come asking about the Canal dos Mortos. That man had brought a notebook and a manner that suggested he had already decided what he was going to write. Dr. Paulo Abreu had brought only the machine and the patients to sit in silence, and after a time, Marcos Figueiredo reached under the table and produced a small tin, the kind used for storing tobacco, and set it down beside the machine, and said that everything he was going to tell was true, and that he had not told it to more than 4 people in 23 years, and that he was telling it now because he was getting older, and because someone should have it on record before he was gone. My name is Marcos Figueiredo. I was born in 1913 in Santarém, on the lower Tapajós, the second son of a man who fished for his living and whose father had done the same. I learned the river the way children in that part of the world learn it, by going out in it from the time I was old enough to hold a line, by watching the color of the water change with the season, by learning what the sound of the current against a root structure meant about depth and speed, by understanding that the river was not background to life in that region, but the substance of it, the thing everything else was organized around. My father was a patient man with fish, and an impatient man with people, and the lessons he gave me about the water were the clearest and most complete education I received. I moved to Tefe in 1938 because the Várzea channels to the east offered better netting conditions than the Tapajós main stem in the dry years, and because I had heard from a man at a market in Manaus that there was work there for a fisherman who knew how to read the flooded forest. That was true. There was work. And in my second season in Tefe, I met Ernesto Carvalho, and after that my life on the water was organized around his. I want to tell you about Ernesto before I tell you about what happened, because if you do not understand Ernesto, you will not understand the weight of what I am about to describe. He was from Parintins originally, the son of a river trader, and he had been on the water in one capacity or another since he was a young man. He was 41 when I met him, 7 years older than me, and he had the quality that the best fishermen have, and that cannot be taught, which is a complete and almost physical attunement to moving water. He could tell you from the sound and color of a channel what it held, how deep the fish were running, where the current split and created the still pockets where the big fish stacked, and he was right about these things with a consistency that other fishermen found unsettling. Some of them said he had a gift. Ernesto did not believe in gifts. He said he paid attention, and that most men did not pay attention, and that this was the only difference between them. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with hands that were so accustomed to wet rope and netting work that the skin of his palms had a permanent roughness like bark. He had a scar across the back of his left hand from a line that had run fast through it during a storm on the Solimões years before he came to Tefe, and the scar had healed in a raised white seam that he said he could use to predict rain, though I never saw him consult it for that purpose. He said it mostly to make people ask him questions he did not intend to answer. He wore the same kind of hat every season, a wide-brimmed thing he bought in Tefe and replaced when it fell apart. And in the field, he carried a notebook in a waterproof cloth that he had sewn himself. And in that notebook he kept records of every stretch of water he had ever worked, depth estimates, current speed, the species composition of each catch, the phase of the moon, the height of the flood. He had been keeping these records for 20 years by the time I met him. The notebook he had with him in the Canal dos Mortos in 1947 was the 7th or 8th such book in a series, and it contained, among its later pages, the most detailed private cartography of that channel that has ever existed, because Ernesto had spent 2 preparation seasons making short survey trips into the canal before he committed to working it fully. We had been partners for 8 years when the 1947 wet season arrived. In those 8 years we had worked the channels east of Tefe through 4 flood cycles, and in each cycle the catches had been good. Because Ernesto chose water the way other men chose horses, deliberately, from extended observation, with patience for the ones that other men dismissed. He had first noticed the Canal dos Mortos 4 years earlier, in 1943, when a period of exceptional flood had pushed the main river high enough to open the connection between the canal and the deep channel fully, and he had gone in briefly, just inside the entrance, and come out with a sample catch that he described to me as the most concentrated population of large pacu he had ever seen in a single half-hour of netting. He said the canal was waiting. He said we would work it when the time was right. He spent the following years mapping it on his short survey trips, and in the winter of 1946, he told me he was ready and that we would go in the coming wet season. I will come back to what Donna Sarita said about the rope. She was not talking about the mooring rope we had brought with us. She was talking about something else, and I did not understand what she meant until I was already on the water and it was too late to ask her. But I want to establish that clearly at the start, because the rope is the thread that runs through this entire account, and I did not understand its significance until the account was already over. The wet season of 1947 was exceptional. The river had been building since December, earlier than most years, and by late February it had already reached the high water mark that usually came in April. The Varzea forest, to the east of Tefe, was fully inundated by the time we began preparing our equipment for the canal run, and the water in the flooded timber was dark with the tannic compounds that leach from the decomposing forest floor when it is submerged. This dark water, what the people of the region call agua preta, black water, is a particular environment. It is low in nutrients but rich in fish during the flood season because the fish move into the flooded forest to feed on the drowned fruit and insects and small creatures that the rising water brings to them. It is also quiet in a way that other water is not quiet. The black water absorbs sound. It does not carry voice or movement the way the main river does. In the Canal dos Mortos, this quality was amplified by the canopy overhead, which was so dense in the flooded sections that the sound of the main river barely reached us even when we were only 300 meters inside the canal entrance. Ernesto had been watching the flood height with particular attention that year. He had a mark on a piling at the Tefe dock, a notch he had cut at the water level he considered optimal for the canal, and when the river reached that notch in the second week of March, he came to find me at my house and said we were going in Monday. He was satisfied in the way that a man who has been planning something for a long time is satisfied when the conditions finally arrive. He checked the equipment twice. He revised his notebook entries for the canal entrance and the first 3 net positions. He was ready. I should say that in those 8 years of partnership, I had come to trust Ernesto's reading of water more than my own, not because my judgment was poor, but because his was exceptional. And in practical terms, this meant that when he said a stretch of water was good, I did not argue with him, even if something about it made me uneasy. The Canal dos Mortos made me uneasy. It had made me uneasy from the first time I went inside it on a short trip with Ernesto 2 seasons before. The quality of the silence in there was not ordinary. I had worked flooded forest channels my entire career, and I knew what the quiet of black water felt like. And the quiet in the Canal dos Mortos was different. It was a silence that had something in it, the way the silence of a room is different when someone is in it and you do not know who. I told Ernesto this. He said I was mistaking quality of water for quality of imagination. He said it with the gentle affection of a man who respects you too much to be dismissive and too confident to be persuaded. I let it go. This was my error, or one of my errors. There were others. Dona Sarita came to our camp on a Saturday morning, 2 days before we were due to depart. She was a woman in her middle 70s at that time, born on a rubber estate upriver, the daughter of tappers who had lived in that part of the Amazon their whole lives, and whose knowledge of the river and its contents had accumulated across generations, in the way that knowledge does among people who have no reason to stop paying attention to their environment. She had lived in Tefe for many years, and she knew every regular fisherman at the dock. She and Ernesto had a particular relationship. He brought her fish from each season's work, good fish, the large ones. And she told him things about the water that she did not tell to everyone who asked. She was not what you would call a superstitious woman. She was practical and she was precise, and when she spoke about the river, she used the same kinds of specific terms that Ernesto used: depth, current direction, season, species behavior. She did not speak in metaphor as a rule. She arrived at our camp with 2 cups of something she had prepared, a tea made from plants I did not recognize, and she sat with us in the camp chairs and said nothing for a time while we drank. I had learned not to hurry Donna Sarita. She organized her thoughts the way she organized everything else in her life, which was carefully and without unnecessary concession to other people's impatience. When she spoke, she addressed Ernesto primarily, which was her habit, but she looked at me when she was making the points she considered most important. She said that the canal had not been fished regularly since before her birth. She said this not as a statement of mystery, but as a statement of fact. The same way she might say that a certain section of river was bad for nets in the dry season because the current was wrong. The canal had not been fished. There was a reason for this. She said that the families who had once lived at the upper reach of the canal, 3 or 4 families of Ribeirinho people who had built their houses on the high ground there and worked the channel for several generations, had moved away from it in the time of her parents' parents, and that the reason they had moved was not flood damage or disease or the failure of the fish, which were all the ordinary reasons that river settlements were abandoned. They had moved because of what came into the canal during the high water. She described it carefully. She said it was a serpent, a great serpent, the kind that the river people had always known lived in the deep main channel and that surfaced rarely and was seen rarely, and that most town people and city people had decided was a legend because they had not seen it themselves. She said the Cobra Grande was real. She said this with the same flat certainty with which she would say the river was deep. She did not dress it in the language of story or legend. She said that in the high water years, when the connection between the main channel and the canal was fully open, the serpent came into the canal to feed in the flooded forest, and that it came there specifically because the flooded forest in that section of canal held the concentrations of large fish that it preferred. The same fish, she said, looking at Ernesto, that he had been documenting in his notebook for 2 seasons. Ernesto listened to all of this with serious attention. I want to be precise about this because it matters. He did not dismiss what she said. He asked her specific questions. He asked how large the creature was, and she described the accounts she had been told by her parents and grandparents, which placed it at 10 to 15 meters in length, possibly larger. He asked how it behaved, whether it was aggressive, and she said it did not attack without reason, but that it was territorial about the water it occupied, and that it would take what it wanted from anyone who came into that water. She said that the important thing, the thing she most needed us to understand, was the behavior around connection. This is where the rope enters the account. She said that the creature was drawn to what was tethered, to what was joined. She used the river dialect word I mentioned before, which means something between tether and claim, the idea that a line between 2 things represents a kind of ownership. She said that in every account she had ever heard of the serpent taking a canoe or a boat, the vessel it took was always the one that was connected to something else, never the free canoe, always the tethered one. She said that the serpent understood, in whatever way a creature of that kind understands things, that a connection was a vulnerability. A tethered boat could not run. A tethered boat was already being held. She made a gesture with both hands, one fist pulling while the other was drawn slowly toward it, and she said, "Be careful about what you tie together out there." Ernesto thanked her. He was respectful, and he was sincere, because he genuinely respected Doña Sarita. And then, after she had gone, he told me that the stories she had described were the standard regional folklore of the Cobra Grande, which was present in river communities throughout the Amazon basin, and that the specific behaviors she attributed to it, the preference for tethered vessels, the territorial feeding grounds, were narrative elements he had encountered in several versions of the same story, which suggested to him that it was a stable legend with consistent mythological features, rather than an account of an animal with documented behaviors. He said the canal was exceptional, and that the catch would be exceptional, and that we were going in Monday morning. I said, "What about the tether?" He said, "We will use a long tether, and we will not tie off to the bank." That was Ernesto. He did not ignore what he heard. He modified his practice slightly to accommodate the information, and then he continued with his plan. In 8 years, I had seen him do this with weather reports, with warning signs, with the advice of other fishermen who said a particular stretch of water was bad. He factored in the warning, made a small adjustment, and proceeded. It had served him well for a very long time. It served him well until it did not. We left from the Tefe dock on Monday morning, in the 3rd week of March. The sound of the dock in that season was a sound I had known for years, and that I can reconstruct exactly in my memory even now. The wet slap of river water against the dock pilings, a rhythmic compression and release that varied with the size of passing boat wakes. The creak of rope under load, where the moored canoes shifted against each other. The hollow knocking of wood on wood that happens when boats bump in a current. The voices of other fishermen loading their equipment, calling across the water in the particular shorthand of men who have worked together a long time. Beneath all of this, beneath all the sounds of human activity at that dock, the river itself, the constant broad-frequency voice of the Amazon running deep and enormous in its bed, a sound so fundamental to life in that place that most people who lived there could no longer hear it consciously, the way you stop hearing your own breathing. We had loaded the night before, 2 canoes, Ernesto's longer by half a meter, mine a little narrower, each carrying the nets and line and float corks and anchor stones that were our tools, plus 6 days of food, water for drinking, the 2 kerosene lanterns, the spare line and rope coils, the clean knives and the work knives, and the spare canvas for weather. Ernesto had his notebook in its waterproof cloth in the bow of his canoe. I had my knife and my tin of tobacco and, tucked against the thwart, the extra mooring rope I always carried. 50 meters of good braided line that my father had given me the year I moved to Tefe, telling me that a fisherman who ran out of rope in the field was a fisherman who had made a series of poor decisions. The tether between our canoes was rigged at 12 meters, which was longer than we usually used, but which Ernesto had specified that morning when we were loading, as a practical response to what Doña Sarita had said. The canal entrance was 40 minutes upstream from the dock by paddle, through a section of main channel where the river narrowed slightly and the far bank was lined with the pale-trunked trees of the flooded forest standing in 2 meters of dark water. We passed 3 other fishing canoes going in the opposite direction, all of them working the main channel sections south of town, and we exchanged the minimal greetings of people with work ahead of them. The day was overcast, the light flat and diffuse, which was typical for that season, and the air was thick with the particular wet season humidity that makes every breath feel like a partial drink of water. When we entered the canal, I noticed the change in sound immediately. The main river's continuous background noise, which had been present throughout the paddle upstream, cut off with the abruptness of a door closing. The canal did not replace it with silence exactly. There were sounds inside the canal, the drip of water from overhanging branches, the slow creak of submerged timber moving in the current, the bird calls from the canopy, which were present but muffled, as if the dense overhead growth was absorbing them before they could travel far. But the fundamental acoustic character of the environment was different from the river. Where the river was open and reverberant, carrying sound laterally across its wide surface, the canal was closed and absorptive. Your voice, speaking at normal volume, carried perhaps 15 meters before it lost coherence, which meant that when Ernesto and I needed to speak across the tether, we had to raise our voices in a way that felt unnatural, that felt like announcing ourselves to the stillness. The water in the canal was the deep brown-black of strong tea, the characteristic color of tannic water that comes through heavily vegetated flood zones. You could see perhaps 30 centimeters into it at most. Below that was darkness, complete and without gradient. The bottom of the canal in the sections we first entered was perhaps 4 meters down, according to Ernesto's survey notes, but it was invisible, a darkness below a darkness. We moved upstream slowly, Ernesto in the lead because he knew the channel, and he consulted his notebook occasionally by pulling it halfway from its cloth case and reading while continuing to paddle with one hand, a practiced movement that spoke of long habit. He called back to me from time to identify the features he had marked. A fallen tree spanning the canal at one point, the top of which was just at the water surface and which could damage a hull if taken at speed, a submerged sandbar on the left side of the canal that created a backwater ideal for net placement. A section where two large fig trees had collapsed together across the water some years ago and had been partially incorporated into the bank, creating a maze of half-submerged timber that held enormous concentrations of fish in its structure. He had names for all of these. The fallen fig section he called the cathedral, because the remaining timber above water formed a series of arched spans. The sandbar backwater he called the pocket. He had named things in every stretch of water he had ever worked. He said it helped him remember the detail. We set our first nets at the pocket in the early afternoon. Net work in the flooded forest requires patience and physical precision, because the space between submerged trees is irregular, and the current, though gentle in these interior channels, will drag a poorly placed net into contact with roots and debris that can tangle or tear it. Ernesto was meticulous about net placement. He moved his canoe in slow, careful arcs, reading the surface for the minor current signatures that told him where the water was moving and where it was still, placing his float corks with exact spacing, checking each anchor stone before he released it. I worked the near side of the pocket while he worked the far side, and we met in the middle of the channel and compared our depth readings and adjusted two of the anchor placements before we were satisfied. The first day's netting was everything he had predicted. By the time we stopped in the early evening and began pulling the first set, we had more fish than I had taken in any comparable period of effort in my entire career at Tefé. The pacu were extraordinary, large and heavy, the dark silver fish that are the best eating in the Amazon and that command the highest price at the market dock. We took tambaqui as well, and several smaller species, and from the deep water below the cathedral's root structure, Ernesto pulled a pirarucu that was so large it nearly capsized his canoe when it came up fighting. He was delighted. He sat in his canoe grinning at the fish for a full minute before he managed it. That expression, that particular delight, is another image I carry from that trip. He loved the work. He loved it the way some men love their faith, with the security of a person who has found the thing they were made for. We ate well that first evening, moored to the submerged log that would later be moved, a position on the right bank of the canal that Ernesto had used on his survey trips and that he called the anchor because it was stable and positioned well for the two nearest net sets. The log was a large trunk, 3 meters across at the widest point, that had drifted against the bank and caught on a root structure sometime in the past, and had been there long enough to develop its own small ecosystem of moss and water plants. We tied off to it with a single line from each canoe, which was our usual method at anchor, and I lit my lantern, and we ate the fish we had cleaned, and the farinha and the dried fruit we had brought, and Ernesto wrote in his notebook by his lantern, while I smoked and listened to the canal. It is the listening of that first evening that I want to describe carefully. It was the first time I heard it, though I did not recognize it as what it was. The evening sounds of the flooded canal began with the birds, whose calls shifted from the daytime species to the nighttime ones as the light faded. A transition that in the flooded forest is more dramatic than it is in the main river environment, because the dense canopy makes the darkness arrive faster and more completely. By full dark, perhaps an hour after sunset, the frog chorus had begun, which is a sound that anyone who has slept on the Amazon's flooded forest will recognize, an enormous, layered, multi-directional chorus of sound that covers the full frequency range from the deep, drumming boom of the tree frog to the thin, repeating chirp of the smallest ground species, and that when it is at full voice, creates a kind of acoustic weather, a continuous sound environment so pervasive that individual calls cannot be separated from it at any distance. Beneath the frog chorus, I heard something else. I want to be precise about when I first noticed it. It was after we had finished eating and Ernesto was writing, and I was smoking my second pipe, so it was perhaps 2 hours after full dark, and I had been sitting quietly for some time with my hand resting on the thwart of my canoe. I felt it before I heard it. The thwart, which was a plank of hardwood bolted across the hull at the midpoint, transmitted a faint vibration to my palm at a very low frequency. It was periodic. It came and went in intervals that I estimated, sitting there in the lantern light with my hand still on the wood, at roughly 2 minutes between each occurrence. Each occurrence lasted perhaps 8 to 10 seconds. The best description I have found in 23 years of trying to describe it is this. Imagine pressing your palm flat against the skin of a very large drum while someone strikes it softly. And imagine that the drum is the floor of your boat, and that the water beneath the boat is what is vibrating. That is what it felt like. The sound component, if you could call it sound, was so low in frequency that it was below the range I could hear through air. I felt it entirely through the wood. I thought, sitting there, that it was the movement of the current through the root structure of the log we were moored to. Root systems in submerged timber do vibrate in current. I had noticed this on other waterways. I thought that, and I accepted it. And I smoked my pipe, and I did not say anything to Ernesto, and after a time I fell asleep in my canoe, in the way that fishermen sleep in the field, which is a light, partial sleep that keeps some part of the awareness connected to the environment around you. I should also say, because I want this record to be complete, that I noticed the behavior of the birds in the canal on that first night, and found it unusual in a way I could not articulate at the time. In the wet season flooded forest, the nighttime birds are constant and predictable in their movements. You hear them crossing overhead, calling from fixed perches, and their sound has a distributed quality, voices from many different positions. In the Canal dos Mortos, the night birds that first evening called only from the canopy directly above us and slightly upstream. None called from the downstream section of the canal, the section between us and the main river entrance. I had spent 15 years listening to the nighttime forest, and I had never observed that particular distribution pattern before, and I thought about it briefly and let it go. The way you let go of the things that do not fit the ordinary category until you have accumulated enough of them that they force a new category. In the morning, everything was as we had left it. The nets were intact, the canoes were where we had moored them. The canal was in the first light of dawn, the same deep brown-black it had been the evening before. Ernesto was already awake and making notes when I opened my eyes. He had a way of waking before first light that I had never been able to match in 8 years. He said it was the habit of decades, that his body had learned to give him time for observation before the day started. We pulled our nets from the first positions and began moving to the secondary set that Ernesto had planned for the midsection of the canal, a pair of locations he called the spine, after the ridge of an ancient sand formation that ran beneath the canal floor there, and that created a current deflection in the water above it that concentrated fish feeding. The morning work went well. The catch at the spine positions was different in species composition from the pocket, with more of the larger tambaki and fewer pacu, and the sizes were exceptional. Ernesto noted everything in his book. We worked through until mid-morning, without anything happening that I would describe as unusual, and then we returned to check the overnight net set at the pocket, and I found the first net had been stripped. I have described this to several people over the years, and none of them have immediately understood what I mean by stripped, because it is not an ordinary failure mode for fishing nets. A net that has been struck by a large caiman will show tearing, often dramatic tearing, along with blood and scale evidence in the water, and sometimes a section of net dragged away entirely. A net that has been found by a family of giant otters will show scale evidence, body oil on the mesh, sometimes the remains of partially consumed fish. A net dragged by flood debris will show tangling, twist damage, abrasion. What I found at the first pocket net that morning was a net that was intact in every physical respect, floating exactly as we had placed it with all floats in position and all anchor stones in place, but from which every fish had been removed. Every fish. There was no blood in the water around the net. There was no damage to the mesh. There was no evidence of the mechanism by which the fish had been taken. They were simply gone, all 40 or 50 of them, removed through the mesh or pulled from the openings at the ends, without disturbing the structure of the net in any observable way. I called Ernesto over. He examined the net carefully and at length, paddling around it and looking at the mesh from multiple angles. Then he looked at the water around it for some time. Then he said that it was probably otters. He said a family of large otters could work a net very thoroughly, and that in high water years, the otter populations moved into the flooded forest in numbers and could be efficient predators of netted fish. I said nothing to dispute this, but I looked at the net and thought about the scale of the removal, the completeness of it, and I thought about what an otter family would have to do, and how long it would take, and what traces they would leave. And I did not say anything because I was not certain enough of my own alternative to argue with him. We reset the net and moved on. The day continued with good catches at other positions. By early afternoon we were on the water in the canal's middle section, anchored at the spine, when I went over the side to check the anchor stone on my canoe, which had been dragging slightly in the slow current and making my canoe swing in a way that was annoying. I reached down into the dark water to reposition the stone, and my hand, following the anchor line down, encountered the tether. The tether was the 12-meter line Ernesto had specified, a good braided rope of the kind we always used for tethering canoes in open water, thick enough to hold against a current and flexible enough to accommodate the small independent movements of two boats on water. When my hand found the midsection of it in the water, I felt immediately that something was different. The braid was distorted in a section perhaps 40 centimeters long, compressed flat and compacted in a way that braided rope does not become through normal use or normal water pressure. It was as if that section had been gripped and held under significant, sustained pressure, enough pressure to deform the structure of the braid without cutting it. The rope was not broken. It was simply wrong in that section, as if it had been used for a purpose different from tethering two canoes. I brought that section up out of the water and held it in the light and looked at it. I called Ernesto over. He came and examined it the way he examined everything, carefully and without immediate conclusion. He held it in his hands and looked at both ends, and then at the middle section, turning it. Then he said that it had probably been caught on a submerged branch or root, and that the current had worked it against the obstruction and compressed the braid. I said that the current in this section of the canal was not fast enough to produce that kind of deformation in braided rope against a stationary object, because I knew enough about the mechanics of rope and water to know that. He said then perhaps it had been snagged briefly on something during our movement upstream. I did not answer. I untied the tether from the compressed section and retired it at a new point, and I took the compressed section and folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. That piece of rope is in the tin on the table in front of you now. I have kept it for 23 years. I kept it instinctively, without fully understanding why, the way you keep something that does not make sense until later, when the later part of the story gives it its meaning. The last time I saw Ernesto fully at ease, the last time his face held only the expressions of a man who is comfortable in his life and his work, was that second evening. We had returned to the anchor log, and the catch that day had been so good that we had needed to transfer some of Ernesto's load into my canoe to balance the weight, and we were both satisfied with the work in the way that physical labor done well produces a particular satisfaction that is different from any other kind. After we had eaten, Ernesto told a story about a government surveyor he had worked for briefly in the years before I knew him, a man who was competent in every technical respect, but who had an irrational and complete terror of moths. Ordinary moths, the small brown moths that are attracted to lamplight in the tropics and that come in the evening in numbers. He told this story well, with the precise observation and flat delivery that made his stories always better than other people's stories of the same caliber. And at the end of it, he laughed in the way he always laughed, with one large hand held over his mouth as if he were trying to contain it. That is the image I have preserved. Ernesto laughing at his own story in the lantern light of the second evening in the Canal dos Mortos. his notebook closed on his knee, the enormous catch secured in the floating basket behind his canoe. The canal around us dark and quiet and apparently benign. I did not hear the tone clearly that second evening until after Ernesto was asleep. It was present earlier, I believe, but the evening sounds covered it, or I was distracted by the conversation and the meal. When the frog chorus was at full voice, and Ernesto had put his notebook away and was lying in the stern of his canoe, I sat with my hand on the thwart, in the way I had sat the previous night, and I felt the vibration again. It was not the same as the previous night. The frequency was identical, or close to identical, but the character of it had changed in a way I found immediately significant. On the first night, the vibrations had felt as if they were coming from a fixed source, somewhere below and behind our position, attenuated by distance. On this second night, the source was moving. I sat and felt it through the wood of my canoe, and I tracked the direction of it across the night, and this is what I tracked. For the first 2 hours after full dark, the source was upstream of us, somewhere in the direction of the canal's upper reach. Gradually, over those 2 hours, it transitioned to a position that felt directly below us, and when it was directly below us, the vibration through the hull of my canoe was stronger. Not dramatically stronger, but enough that I could feel it in my feet as well as my hand. Then, sometime in the deep middle of the night when the frog chorus thinned slightly, the source moved again, and by the time the sky began to gray before dawn it was downstream of us, between our position and the canal entrance. Something had circled us during the night. I lay in my canoe in the pre-dawn dark, and I thought about that. And I felt the last few occurrences of the vibration as the source moved downstream and finally out of the range where I could feel it. And I thought about Doña Sarita's hands, the pulling gesture, and I thought about the compressed section of tether rope in my shirt pocket, and I thought about the stripped net. I did not sleep again that night. When the dawn came and Ernesto woke and sat up and reached for his notebook, I told him what I had tracked. He listened to me the way he always listened when I described something about the water. He gave me his full attention, and he did not interrupt, and when I was finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the boto, the freshwater dolphins, gathered in numbers in the flooded canal in high water years, and that they communicated through water at low frequencies, and that their communication sounds could be felt as vibration through the hull of a boat. He said he had read about this in a natural history published in Manaus some years before. He said that a group of boto circling the anchor position during the night to investigate the canoes was a plausible explanation for what I had described. I had worked the Amazon watershed for 15 years. I had heard boto at night on the water my entire career. I knew what boto communication felt like through a boat hull. I said nothing, because Ernesto was looking at me with the calm certainty of a man who has found a satisfactory explanation and is ready to proceed with the day, and because our catch was exceptional, and because I had not yet seen anything, only heard and felt things that had plausible explanations if you were willing to accept them. I was not certain enough to insist, and so I did not insist. On the third day, the mooring log was not where we had left it. I will say this plainly. Logs move. In high water, in the wet season, with the river pushing into the flooded forest and creating currents in places that are still in the dry months, logs move. A log that is caught on a root structure can be freed by a change in current pressure and drift to a new position. This is ordinary. I knew this. So when we returned downstream to the anchor position in the mid-morning of the third day and found the log was not where it had been, I did not immediately react. I looked for it and found it 40 meters downstream, caught in a new root system, still stable, still suitable for mooring. We paddled to it and tied off. But I stood in my canoe and looked at the log for a time, because something was not right about its new position, and I was trying to understand what it was. The current in the canal section where the log had been resting ran gently from upstream to downstream, from the upper reaches of the canal toward the main river, which was the correct direction for a freed log to drift. The new position of the log was downstream of its original position, which was consistent with the current, but the angle of the log in its new position was different. In its original position, the log had been oriented roughly perpendicular to the canal banks, which was the natural orientation for a large piece of timber caught against a bank in current. In its new position, it was oriented at roughly 45 degrees, angled toward the far bank, as if whatever had moved it laterally across the canal rather than simply carrying it downstream. And the distance, 40 meters of drift in a current that moved at perhaps 1 kilometer per hour overnight, perhaps 10 hours of darkness, would produce approximately 10 to 15 meters of drift under most conditions I had worked. The log had moved 40 meters. The current alone, in that time, at that speed, should not have moved it 40 meters. I said nothing about this to Ernesto. I had reached the limit of what I could persuade him to notice by drawing his attention to things, and I understood that the persuasion that was available to me through argument had been fully deployed on the previous day, and that what would persuade Ernesto to leave the canal was not my interpretation of evidence, but the kind of direct, unambiguous evidence that his own very good eyes would bring him in time. I tied my canoe to the log and helped him unload the nets and did the morning's work. We found the pressure marks in the mud that afternoon. We had moved further downstream for the mid-afternoon net check, working toward the lower sections of the canal that Ernesto had planned for the 4th and 5th days, and in doing so, we passed a bend in the canal where the channel curved left, and the outside of the bend had an exposed bar of dark silt, a small beach no more than 4 meters wide, that the receding water had revealed since our last passage. The bar was in the shade of the canopy, and its surface was dark and damp, still wet from the recent water, and it held impressions the way fresh silt holds impressions, which is perfectly the way wax holds a seal. Ernesto saw them before I did. He stopped paddling and let his canoe glide to a halt 20 meters from the bar, and he held his paddle raised and just looked. I came up alongside him and looked too. The impressions were not footprints. They were not the kind of impression made by a foot or a paw or any kind of limb. They were long, oval depressions in the mud, each depression perhaps 60 centimeters across at its widest point, and perhaps 1.5 to 2 meters long. They were arranged in a winding series from one end of the exposed bar to the other, slightly overlapping in places, slightly separated in others, but following a continuous, sinuous path across the silt, in the pattern that a very large body would make if it had rested there, or crossed there, moving from the water on one side of the bar to the water on the other. The width of the track series at its widest point, the widest continuous impression from one margin of the track to the other, was approximately 10 to 12 meters. The silt surface within the impressions was smooth and compacted, the kind of compression produced by sustained weight rather than by impact or motion. I looked at those impressions for a very long time. I estimated that the most recent of them had been made within the last several hours, because the silt surface at the margins of the impressions was still sharp and unwrinkled, which meant the water had not yet returned to blur them, and the sun had not yet cracked them. Whatever had made them had been on that bar in the morning while we were working our nets in the upstream section. I looked at Ernesto. He was looking at the impressions with his paddle still raised and his notebook visible at the bow of his canoe. He had his field expression on, the expression of careful professional assessment that he used when he was evaluating an unfamiliar piece of water. After a long moment, he said that the anaconda grew to significant size in the flooded forest, and that he had heard accounts of specimens reaching 8 or 9 meters in length, and that a large anaconda would produce exactly the kind of impression we were looking at, a sinuous body track across soft silt. He said this in a measured and considered way, as if presenting his conclusion of a professional evaluation. I said, "Ernesto, that track is 12 meters across. An anaconda of 9 meters would produce a track less than a meter across." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the impressions again. He looked at his paddle. Then he said we would move the network to the lower canal section, which was closer to the main river entrance, and that we would finish our stay in the canal from that position rather than working the upper reaches. He said this in the tone of voice he used when he was making a practical operational adjustment, not an emergency decision, not a retreat, but a reallocation of effort in response to new information. He paddled past the bar without looking at it again. I followed him, but I looked at the bar as I passed it, and I looked at the scale of those impressions in the dark silt, and I thought about the tone I had been hearing for 2 nights, through the floor of my canoe, and I thought about the compressed rope in my shirt pocket, and I thought about Doña Sarita's hands, and I thought, we should be going to the main river, not to the lower canal, to the main river. I thought this, and I did not say it. I had said enough and been heard and not persuaded him. I thought, one more night. If there is anything else tonight, I will insist in the morning. This is the other error. The night that followed was not the kind of night that allows for decisions made in the morning. We anchored in the lower canal section, as Ernesto had said, tied to a different log from the one that had been moved, one that was further from the banks and more fully in the channel. The afternoon work was good. The lower canal was as productive as the upper, and by evening we had taken enough additional fish to replace most of what had been lost from the stripped net 2 days before. Ernesto was satisfied with the total count for the trip, and said we were likely to return a day early, which would give us a good margin on the fish staying fresh in the basket. He ate well, and wrote in his notebook, and was in good spirits. I ate and smoked, and listened to the canal with my hand on the thwart. The tone was present before dark. This is the significant departure from the previous 2 nights. On the previous nights, the tone had not been present or had not been detectable during the daytime and evening hours. It had emerged after full dark, sometime between sunset and the deepening of the frog chorus. On this 3rd night it was present before we had finished mooring the canoes, before the last of the daylight had left the canal, arriving in the hull of my canoe through my hand, before I had even settled into the seat. It was at the same frequency, but at an amplitude that was immediately different from either of the previous nights. Not louder as heard through air, because I still could not hear it through air, but stronger through the wood, strong enough that I did not need to hold my hand still and attend carefully. I could feel it simply sitting with my weight, distributed normally in the boat. I told Ernesto immediately. I said, the vibration is here already. It is much stronger than the previous nights. He put his hand on the hull of his own canoe. He held it there. His face did not change immediately. Then it changed. He felt it too. He sat with his hand on the hull for a full minute, timing the intervals, and when he looked at me, his expression was the one I had been waiting to see for 2 days. The expression of a man who is revising something fundamental in his assessment of his situation. He was not frightened, not yet, but he was no longer certain, and for Ernesto, that uncertainty was visible in a way that his ordinary expressions were not. He said, "It is more frequent than you described." I said yes. He said, "What is the interval now?" I counted several occurrences. I said, 60 to 90 seconds. It was 2 minutes before. We looked at each other across the 12 meters of tether. The frog chorus had begun, which was loud enough to obscure most sounds above a certain frequency, but the vibration was not a sound above any frequency I could hear. It was in the wood and the water. It was below everything. Ernesto said, "We should pull the nets and go." I said yes. We began. Ernesto went to his first net position and started pulling hand over hand. I went to mine. The pulling went normally for perhaps 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes I was watching the water and the canal around us more than I was watching the net, and I noticed that the quality of the darkness beneath the surface of the canal was shifting in a way I did not immediately have language for. The tannic water was uniformly dark under normal conditions, a darkness without variation. But now there was a darker zone in the canal to the left of Ernesto's position. Not a shadow, not the absence of light, but the presence of something, a mass of volume beneath the surface that displaced the surrounding darkness the way a solid object displaces water, creating a boundary between its opacity and the opacity around it. It extended for several meters. It moved with a slow, periodic expansion and contraction, the same period as the vibration in the hull of my canoe. I stopped pulling the net. I looked at this darker zone, and I understood what I was looking at. Not intellectually, not as a conclusion reached by reasoning from evidence, but with the immediacy of a physical recognition, the way your body understands danger before your mind has finished the sentence. It was an animal. It was an enormous animal lying in the water to the left of Ernesto's position, and it was breathing. I could see, in the faint lantern light that reached across the canal to that side, a faint linear marking along the upper surface of the mass, a pale band, like a stripe or a seam in the scale pattern of something very large. The mass was not moving toward us. It was positioned, settled, as if it had been there for some time and was content to remain. Its scale was beyond anything I had reference for. I had seen anaconda in the wild, large ones, specimens that were correctly impressive, and this was not that. This was something else, in the way that a house is not a fence, in the way that the main river is not a stream. The mass in that water was enormous, and it was alive, and it was 10 meters from Ernesto's canoe. I said his name. I said, "Ernesto," in a voice that was lower than I intended. He had his back to the dark zone. "He was still pulling net," he said, "almost done with this end," without looking up. I said his name again, differently. He looked up. He saw my face. He turned and looked at the canal to his left. He was still, for 3 seconds exactly. I counted them. Then the tether went rigid. I felt it in my canoe before I saw it happen in his. The 12 meters of braided rope between our two boats suddenly went tight, not with the gradual tension of a current catching it, not with the tug of a drifting anchor, but with the immediate, complete rigidity of a line under load from a fixed, powerful, deliberate source. I saw the rope lift out of the water running off it in a sheet, and I saw the bow of Ernesto's canoe swing left, toward the dark zone, with a slowness that made what was happening worse, not better. The slowness was the most terrible thing about it. It was not violence. It was not a strike or a lunge. It was the measured, unhurried pull of something that had done this before and had no reason to hurry. Ernesto grabbed his paddle. He put it in the water on his right side and pulled a full stroke. The canoe did not respond. He pulled again, his full strength, both arms and his back, and his experience, and the canoe continued moving left. He looked down at the tether, and then at me, and his expression was the expression of a man who has understood a situation completely, and is accepting it, and making the only remaining decision available to him. And he said, "Cut it." He said this once, clearly, in the voice he used when he was giving a direct operational instruction. Not the frightened voice of a man overwhelmed by events, but the level voice of a man who has assessed the options and identified the only one that has any value. Cut it. Go. I had my knife in my belt. The knife was open in my hand before I had processed the decision. I have asked myself in 23 years whether I hesitated, and the honest answer is that I do not know. That the span of time between Ernesto's words and the motion of the knife against the tether is not available to my memory as a duration I can measure. I know that I looked at Ernesto's face before I cut, and I know what his face looked like, and I know that he was looking at me and not at the water to his left, and I know that what his face showed was not panic, and not accusation, and not surrender, but something closer to the look of a man who has given an instruction he is certain of, and is waiting for it to be followed. I cut the tether. Ernesto's canoe moved immediately, pulled with the same deliberate, controlled steadiness as before, no faster after the tether was cut than before, which told me that the tether itself had not been a significant source of resistance. Ernesto paddled. He put his paddle in on the left side and pulled toward the right bank, and then on the right side and pulled toward the left bank, and then alternating, everything he had, and for perhaps 20 seconds he held his position against the pull, and then he did not. The canoe moved. It moved toward the left bank and toward the dark zone in the water there, and it moved at a speed that his paddle could not answer no matter how hard he worked it. I was already paddling downstream. I have to tell you this plainly. I was already moving when his canoe was still visible. I was following the instruction I had been given, which was to go. I paddled and I looked back once, and the lantern on Ernesto's canoe was still lit, the light moving toward the left bank at the same controlled, terrible speed, and I could see Ernesto in the stern of his canoe with his paddle raised. Not paddling, but holding the paddle raised. And I do not know what this meant, whether he was resting or whether it meant what I have been afraid it meant, which is that he had accepted what was happening and had stopped. I looked back once, and then I did not look back again. I paddled for the canal entrance. I ran the bow of my canoe into submerged timber twice in the dark, and pushed off and kept going. The canal at night without a lantern is complete darkness. I navigated by the feel of the current, which ran gently toward the main river, and which I followed by letting my paddle search for where the water pushed back, which was the direction of flow. I do not know how long I was in the canal. My sense of time had dissolved entirely. I came out into the main river channel when the sky was already graying in the east, the early gray of the Amazonian pre-dawn that arrives before any direct light, and that turns the river surface a uniform lead color without direction or depth. I paddled downstream to Tefé. I reached the dock at first light. Rodrigo Peixoto was there, a younger fisherman who worked the channels north of town and who was unloading his own canoe after a night trip. And he saw me come in, and he saw my face, and he put down what he was unloading and came to the dock edge and took my bowline without saying anything. I tied off. I sat in the canoe for a while. Rodrigo waited. When I told him what had happened, he said nothing at first. Then he said he would get 2 other men and go in at dawn. I said, "Wait until the light is full." He said yes. They went in when the sun was fully up. 3 men in 2 canoes, Rodrigo and 2 others from the dock, men who were experienced in the channels and who knew the Canal dos Mortos well enough to work it quickly in the daylight. They searched for 2 full days. They found the remains of our net positions, the anchor stones, the float corks drifting loose. They found the floating basket with the catch from the previous days still in it, which had drifted into the lower canal section and caught on a root. They found Ernesto's notebook, still in its waterproof cloth, floating face down in the water near the pocket location, and they brought it back and gave it to me, and I have never opened it. It is in my house. They found no trace of Ernesto or his canoe. They found no trace of the creature. What they did find, on the left bank of the canal at the point where Ernesto's canoe had been pulled, was a section of rope. It was mooring rope, braided, of the same construction as what I used, and it was compressed flat in the middle in a section approximately 60 centimeters long, with the impression of something massive having gripped it and held it with sustained pressure. It was not our tether rope. The tether had been cut, and I had both ends of it when I came out of the canal. It was additional rope that had been on the bank of the canal or in the water there, and the creature had been against it, or over it, or through it, and had left its signature in the braid before it went back into the water. Rodrigo brought me this piece of rope as well. He had understood, somehow, that it was evidence, that I would want it. I keep it in the tin. Both pieces are in the tin. I have taken them out perhaps 30 times across 23 years, never together, always one at a time, and I have held them and looked at them and put them back. They are not evidence in any formal sense. No court or inquiry would accept a compressed piece of rope as evidence of a creature that the scientific world has not confirmed. I am not asking anyone to accept them as evidence. I kept them because a man who has seen something that has no category needs something that confirms he did not construct the experience from fear and darkness and 3 nights without sleep, and these 2 pieces of rope confirm that to me, and that is sufficient. The compressed section from the tether, which I took from the canal on the 2nd day, and the section from the bank that Rodrigo found after. 2 pieces of rope, both showing the same kind of compression, both bearing the same impression of something very large having exerted sustained pressure on braided line. Dona Sarita's hands, the pulling gesture, the word she had used that meant tether and claim, and the proof of ownership. I held those 2 pieces of rope the day Rodrigo gave the second one to me, and I thought about what she had been describing when she made that gesture, and I understood finally and completely what she had meant, and I understood that she had known this because she had either seen it herself or because someone she trusted had described it to her with the specificity of genuine witness, not the generality of legend. There are things that I have asked myself across these 23 years, and I want to state them for your record, Dr. Abreu, because they are the honest accounting of what I know and what I do not know. I do not know what happened to Ernesto Carvalho after his lantern went into the water. I know that the canal was searched by experienced men who knew that water and that they found nothing, and I know what finding nothing in a thorough search of a 4-kilometer channel means in practical terms. I know that Ernesto was a strong man who could swim well, which in the Amazon is a capacity whose limits are clear. I know that the creature that pulled his canoe into the bank was large enough and purposeful enough that I do not believe a man in a canoe and then in the water had the means to change his situation once the tether was cut. I know that I have never had information that contradicted this belief. I know that his notebook is in a shelf in my house and that I have not been able to open it. I know that I made the right decision when I cut the tether. I know this because Ernesto told me to cut it, and because Ernesto was right about water for the entirety of the time I knew him, and because the alternative, both canoes being taken, is not an outcome that produces a different survivor. I know all of this. What I carry that I cannot put down is the face he was making when I raised the knife to the tether. The expression, the specific quality of it, which was acceptance and instruction, and the particular look of a man who has found the only correct solution to a problem and is waiting for it to be implemented. I cut the tether and I followed his instruction, and he had given me instructions for 8 years and he had been right, and he was right about this too. That is the correct accounting. That is the rational and accurate statement of what happened. I carry it anyway. I carry the face, and I carry the 20 seconds his canoe held position before it moved, and I carry the raised paddle at the end, and I have been carrying these things for 23 years, and I do not expect to put them down. A man carries what he carries. The rope is in the tin. Ernesto's notebook is on the shelf. The Canal dos Mortos is 40 minutes upstream from this dock, and it is there now, and it was there last season, and it will be there when I am gone. And what is in it during the high water of the wet season is there too, circling in the dark water below the tethered canoes of men who have not heard what I have told you today. I have told you because you came with a machine and patience, and no notebook full of conclusions you had already reached, and because you listened to all of it without the expression that other people have had when I described the tracks on the mud bar, the one that says they are assembling an explanation that will let them be comfortable. I have told you because someone should have it recorded. And I have told you because Doña Sarita told us, plainly and specifically, and we listened and did not fully understand. And I think that if someone had recorded what she said the way you are recording what I am saying, Ernesto would have understood it too, and we would have left the canal on the second morning when we found the stripped net, and he would be an old man somewhere in Tefe right now, and his notebook would be open and full of new entries. The rope is in the tin. You can look at it. I would prefer that you not take it from the room.